So this is a very important story for me to be reading because even though I didn't write it, you might not know this, I am not actually Blair Ault, but I was present for this story for most of it. So, best job interview ever. 9 months after my 21st birthday, I was sitting at Antidote studying for the GRE. I'd graduated college without much direction in a bleak 2010 job market, so I figured it didn't hurt to look into hiding within the context of education until it improved. As I struggled to remaster the math I'd forgotten as a political science major, a certifiable party bus rolled into the parking lot at 10:30 a.m. To my semi-surprise, my friend Christopher Robin, no relation to Pooh Bear, hopped out. Christopher and I had run tech together with Catastrophic Theater and hung out in the light booth where we quickly established a sibling dynamic. When he saw me and saw the very responsible studying activity I was engaged in, he asked fairly commandingly, "What are you doing right now?" More an accusation than a real question. My reply had no chance of being satisfactory, and he let me know that this party bus was going to Shiner, Texas, as an anniversary party for the employees of Poison Girl Bar, and that I should definitely go with them. At first, I thanked him for the invitation, but immediately shut down the idea of, one, choosing fun on a day that I had clearly saved for self-improvement, and perhaps more importantly, two, getting on a bus with a bunch of mostly strangers that were leaving the city limits. In my mind, I knew that if I went, it'd be something I couldn't tell my grandmother without causing a stroke. I had been raised not just to be a nerd, but a square nerd. A nerd who considers other people's risks but never pursues them on her own. But as Christopher started bringing coffee orders to the bus, I felt an urge to throw my books in the car and just go. Something about graduating college with a college degree, only to be told it would be tough to be hired, felt like a betrayal of following the rules. And plus, there were plenty of things I knew not to tell my grandmother about. The doors of the bus were still open when I climbed in, and Christopher immediately shouted, "There she is!" and gave me a big hug. Christopher always knew how to make me feel welcome, and every time we occupied shared space. But I wondered if the rest of the bus would be so enthusiastic about a younger newcomer. I looked at the rest of the passengers to see faces I mostly knew from being served drinks by them in the previous 9 months. Poison Girl still holds a gold standard of carding everyone who comes to the door. And so I hadn't even had a year yet of visiting to get to know anyone other than Christopher, who worked the door and bar back. One of the bartenders, with a very red beard, caught my eye. I was sort of afraid of him because he was known to be fairly surly, and I always tried to make my orders as straightforward as possible to avoid any rebuke. I saw quite a few women on the bus, which even now is an instant relaxation flag for me, especially when one of them, Miriam, who I found out was one of the owners of the bar, christened me number 16, as I was the 16th person on the bus. And therefore, whenever the bus stopped, the only way it would start again is if we counted off and got all the way through to the last number, which was now me. It's about 2 hours to Shiner from Houston, and the bus was stocked with beer, and the TV was playing Loretta Lynn music videos. Although several beers were offered to me, I was hesitant to become intoxicated so as not to embarrass myself in front of a bunch of potentially new friends. So I'd grown up in bars and in the live theater world. I'd mostly associated consuming alcohol with people vomiting unnecessarily. And I didn't know if I could really handle motion sickness with alcohol. I also had not come around quite to loving the taste of any beer and was content to nurse a Topo Chico. We got to the picnic just in time to walk around the fundraising auction, and I admired the brand new tractors with a now not so scary red-bearded Jonas and a fellow named Riaz, who I learned was someone else who worked the door, and in fact, was working the door that night. He was already a little tipsy at 3 p.m, and I asked him how he would turn it around before his shift started. I don't remember what his answer was, but I came to understand that some bar professionals were not necessarily expected to be sober while working as long as they did their job competently and without significant error. At that time, he seemed unconcerned that his current intoxication would become a later problem. The picnic was fun in a wholesome way, lots of polka and Southern delights. One of the other owners, Dawn, stood out as someone who could find the fun wherever she went, and she invited me to sit down next to her and play some bingo. As the sun started to set, we all got back on the bus to head home, and I reveled in the loud celebration when I confirmed that number 16 was on the bus, and we could ride on. Even on the way back, I maintained a sober approach as we pulled into the parking lot across the street from Poison Girl to let off the employees who needed to get to their shifts on time. Ever since we'd stopped at a gas station, Riaz looked a little worse for the wear, and when the doors opened for him to get out to work, he didn't even get up from his seat. It was then that he admitted to the whole bus that he was probably too intoxicated to work properly and asked if it was possible anyone could cover his shift. I will admit now that since he revealed to me at the picnic that he was expected to work that evening, I pondered what it would be like to actually work at Poison Girl. The same urge that got me to toss my GRE books in the car now pushed me to raise my voice to say, I can do it. I admitted my experience was not my best quality, but I was perhaps curious and confident enough and definitely sober enough to try to learn. I think a large part of me expected that they'd turn down the offer, but to my surprise, Riaz shrugged and gestured to Miriam and Dawn and their partners, who were also owners and both named Scott. Ultimately, they would need to sign off on the switch, and I believe it was one of the Scotts who immediately said, "You're hired," with a chuckle. My only request was that someone help me get my car so I wouldn't have to deal with it late at night, and I made it back to Poison Girl for a tutorial on how to tell if an ID is fake and the expectation to absolutely card everyone, even if they looked of age. My first lesson of the night was that being a door person is similar to being a hostess at a restaurant. It's one of the best places to start if you don't really have a lot of experience. But ultimately, the first line of defense for the bar to keep its vibes solid from intoxicated intruders. I also understand now that Poison Girl liked hiring women to be their door people because arriving guests tend not to be automatically defensive when told they aren't allowed in, when the person delivering the news has less of a threatening presence. At the end of that night, I made $95 in cash for approximately 6 hours of work. And I realized I had made more per hour than my current part-time gig at the Honors College. I was hooked, not because of the pay, but because the company I enjoyed on the bus became the company I enjoyed working with. A few years after I boarded the party bus, I moved over to Friday nights at their sister bar, Little Dipper, downtown, and my Montrose family became my downtown family. I do cringe a little bit When other people use family to describe their work environments as it's a tool, many small business owners use to guilt workers into more labor without commensurate compensation. But so much of the awkwardness and pain of being a 20-something was navigated while I worked there. Those folks watched me make all of the mistakes a newbie bartender is likely to make, on top of all of the social awkwardness of a post-adolescent in love with not quite the right partners. When I eventually moved from a day job at the university to a day job with a high school, I always kept my one shift a week because the working of making cocktails on a Friday night with friends made working in public education in Texas bearable. It also turns out the techniques that work to manage the youth work great on intoxicated adults. And when I found out that Miriam was also an elementary school teacher, I recognized that my christening as number 16 was more of a field trip tactic than anything else. My grandmother did not know how much of my time was spent working at a bar. And she passed away 10 years ago. So unless ghosts can spy on their living relatives, she does not know that when I finally decided to go to grad school, it was my bar job that kept me financially afloat until I found my current position as a whiskey educator for the only distillery in the country with 2 women's names on the bottle that are not dead or fictional. As she was ever the feminist who drilled into me that education was the best liberation for women, I am fairly certain she'd be proud of me. I never did end up needing to take the GRE, and I've never had a job where my resume mattered more than just being kind to the people who needed some help. While there is no shame to those that followed more traditional routes, I can't say I want to be living any other life than the one where my career started on a party bus with 15 other fast friends.
Yeah, all right, okay, yeah, all right. No, I think I'm finally starting to get why it is y'all not on cue. I don't usually do this, you see. I'm not the one up here asking people for attention. I just demand the shit. Much like the last story said, working with people can be like a family. I have a close-knit community of people that I work with at the Wrestlers Court. Glenda Dannon, my bailiff, the best temporary bailiff that money can rent. She's not always on point, but she can get you. Don't worry about it. My anchor, my announcer, future man, we don't really know how far in the future he comes from, but whenever he shows up, he's always saying, you ought to look out. We're gonna go ahead and keep it rolling with the next story called Ain't Shit. Now, this story is written by Rachel Reyes Hale Rodriguez, and it's read, I'm sorry, again, I don't do this shit, Amanda, She Might Kill You. Give it up.